Imagine waking up to find that someone else's cattle are grazing freely on your own land, tearing up the pasture you've nurtured for years, and the culprit is none other than your HOA president, a woman who believes she owns the whole neighborhood. That's exactly what I faced when HOA Karen decided my ranch pasture was free food for her livestock. But she didn't know I had a pack of trained wolves, and I wasn't about to sit back and let her walk all over me. Let us know where you're watching from today, and if you're new here, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to join our growing community. I woke up one early morning to a strange, unsettling sound. It wasn't the usual soft rustle of wind through the pines or the distant coyote calls that I'd grown used to on my ranch. No, this was heavier, more chaotic, the pounding of hooves and the sound of chewing. I stepped out onto my porch with a cup of coffee in hand, only to drop it right there on the steps. My pasture, the one I'd spent years tending, planting the right grasses and keeping in perfect shape, was overrun with cattle that weren't mine. I'd never seen such a mess in my life. A dozen or more cows were trampling the soil, ripping up the tender shoots of alfalfa I had just planted this past spring. My stomach twisted in anger as I took in the sight. And then I saw her HOA Karen. She stood on the other side of the fence, arms folded, wearing that smug grin I'd come to recognize. If arrogance had a face, it was hers. Mourning, she shouted, like this was some casual meet and greet. "Hope you don't mind." The HOA agreed this pasture wasn't being put to good use, so I let my cattle roam here for a while. Better than wasting good grass, I clenched my jaw, trying to stay calm. "Karen, this is my land. You can't just turn my pasture into your free buffet. Get your cattle out of here." She tilted her head and smirked, as if I'd just said something amusing. "Your land. Oh, honey. The HOA says this field falls under shared maintenance. If you don't like it, bring it up at the next board meeting." That was it, the last straw. I wasn't about to argue over a fence like two kids in a sandbox. I walked down the steps and marched straight into the field, waving my arms and shouting to drive the cattle back toward her property line. They didn't budge much. Her cattle were stubborn, and so was she. I could see her leaning against the fence, watching me struggle, clearly enjoying every second of it. "You're going to tire yourself out," she called out. "You might as well just let them graze. Saves me on feed." I stopped and stared at her, my blood boiling. This wasn't just about grass anymore. This was about respect, about boundaries. I'd worked this ranch with my bare hands. Every inch of it was mine, earned through sweat and long nights. And here she was, treating it like her personal playground. I grabbed my phone and snapped a series of pictures of the cattle, the broken fence post where she'd clearly forced entry, even her standing there like she owned the place. "You'll regret this, Karen," I muttered, half to myself. By the time I managed to chase half the herd out, the damage was already done. Deep hoofprints scarred the soil, and chunks of grass had been torn out as if a tornado had passed through. I'd need weeks to restore the field to what it was. And that realization, that sense of being trampled on, not just my land, but my pride, lit a fire in me. I spent the rest of the morning calling every member of the HOA board I could reach. Most of them were too busy to talk, and a couple outright told me Karen had full discretion over unused spaces. That's when it hit me. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was Karen using her position as HOA president to push her weight around. She thought she could bully me, just like she'd done to others in the neighborhood. Well, she picked the wrong rancher. By late afternoon, I had documented everything: the property lines, the photos, even a video of her refusing to move the cattle. I drove down to the county records office to double-check my land deed. Sure enough, the pasture fell well within my boundaries. There wasn't a single clause about it being shared with anyone. Karen was lying, plain and simple. As I drove back home, I spotted her cattle still grazing near the fence line, and Karen's truck parked nearby. She was talking to one of the other HOA board members, gesturing toward my house. I could tell from her animated hand movements that she was spinning some tale about me being uncooperative. I smiled to myself. Let her talk. Let her gather her little crew, because I wasn't done, not by a long shot. That evening, as the sun dipped low and the fields turned gold, I stood by the fence and watched her herd. I remembered the wolves I kept in a special enclosure up near the woods. They weren't wild, they were part of a conservation program I'd joined years ago, trained, healthy, and utterly majestic. And suddenly, a plan began to form in my mind. This wasn't going to be solved by yelling across fences or waiting for useless HOA meetings. Karen needed to be reminded of what happens when you trample someone's land and pride. I ran my hand over the fence post, feeling the splintered wood, and whispered to myself, time to teach her a lesson she won't forget. The next morning, I didn't waste any time. By sunrise, I was already out by the fence, checking the damage from yesterday. The field looked worse than I remembered, hoof marks everywhere, and my new irrigation pipes had been bent and dragged by those heavy animals. I wasn't just angry anymore. I was determined. Karen was going to hear me out whether she liked it or not. I spotted her cattle wandering near the far side of my pasture, munching on what was left of my alfalfa. Then, like clockwork, Karen's SUV rolled up. She stepped out, dressed in her usual pink jacket and oversized sunglasses, sipping on a fancy coffee like she was out for a casual stroll. "Karen," I called, my voice sharp enough to cut through the morning air. "Get your cattle out of my pasture, now!" She didn't even flinch. She walked over to the fence like she had all the time in the world, leaning casually against it. "Oh, good morning to you too," she said with that smirk I'd come to hate. "You really should learn to relax." "Neighbor, it's just grass. My cows aren't hurting anything. Just grass," I shot back. That just grass cost me months of work and thousands of dollars. And in case you forgot, this is my land. Karen crossed her arms. The HOA documents clearly state that open land within our boundary lines is subject to community use. Your pasture falls under that category. We all agreed on it years ago. I laughed, not because it was funny, but because of how absurd it sounded. "Karen, I've read those documents more times than I can count, and I know every square foot of this ranch. Don't stand there and tell me you own my land because you sit on some board. You're not above the law." She shrugged, clearly unfazed. "Look, if you don't like the arrangement, you're welcome to bring it up in the next meeting. But until then, my cattle will stay where they are." That was it. I climbed over the fence and marched toward the herd. Karen called out, "Hey, what do you think you're doing? What I should have done yesterday," I said, waving my arms and clapping loudly to push the cattle back toward her property. They scattered, confused but slowly moving away from the lushest part of my field. Karen stomped up to the fence, shouting, "You can't just force my animals off this land. This is harassment. Harassment!" I snapped. "Lady, you're trespassing." "You broke a fence post to get your herd in here. I could have the sheriff out here right now." Her face darkened. "Oh, don't think for a second the sheriff will side with you. Everyone knows you've always been difficult. You've been against the HOA since day one." I took a deep breath, trying to keep my temper in check. This isn't about being difficult. It's about you crossing the line, and I won't let it slide. Karen pulled out her phone, waving it in my face. "Fine, let's make this official. I'll record how aggressive you're being. We'll let the HOA decide who's right." I smiled grimly. "Go ahead. Record me. Just make sure you also record this." I pointed at the broken fence post and snapped another photo with my phone. "This is all the evidence I need when I take this to court." For the first time, I saw her smile falter. She quickly hid it, but I knew I had struck a nerve. "You wouldn't dare," she muttered. "Try me," I said. We stood there, glaring at each other for a long moment, neither of us backing down. Finally, she threw up her hands. "Fine, I'll move them today. But you're making a big mistake picking a fight with me." "Funny," I replied. "I was thinking the same thing about you." Karen stomped back to her SUV, her heels digging into the dirt as she left. I watched her drive off, my heart pounding. I knew this wasn't over. Karen was the type who would come back twice as hard, and I had to be ready. That evening, I repaired the fence and reinforced it with steel wire. As I worked, my mind replayed the confrontation over and over. Her arrogance, her belief that her HOA title made her untouchable, it burned me up inside. I thought about my wolves again. They were in their enclosure up near the woods, pacing gracefully in the twilight. Strong, loyal, and smart. They weren't wild anymore. I'd raised them since they were pups as part of a licensed conservation effort. They trusted me. And suddenly, a thought came to me. What if I didn't just fight Karen with paperwork and phone calls? What if I showed her, in the most unmistakable way possible, that this ranch wasn't hers to take? I leaned on the fence, staring into the darkening sky. Karen thought she could intimidate me with her title, but I had something far more powerful, a connection to this land, to the animals on it. She'd soon learn that messing with a rancher is a whole different kind of fight. The day after our confrontation, I drove straight to the county records office with a folder full of photos, videos, and copies of my property deed. I wasn't going to give Karen any room to twist the truth. The clerk at the counter confirmed what I already knew: my pasture was fully within my property line, and there was no mention of it being communal land. I had every legal right to keep her cattle off my field. "Seems like your HOA president is overstepping her bounds," the clerk said, shaking her head. "You want me to make you a certified copy of this deed that way. If she tries anything, you've got the official paperwork." "Yes." "Please," I said, sliding over the fee. I walked out of there holding that document like a shield. Karen could argue all she wanted, but the law was on my side. When I got back to the ranch, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The fence I had repaired last night had been tampered with again. A section of wire I'd tightened was loose, as if someone had deliberately pulled at it. And right there in my pasture, Karen's cattle were back happily chewing through what little grass was left. I slammed my truck door and stormed over. "Karen," I bellowed, my voice echoing across the field. She appeared a moment later, walking casually from the dirt path behind her property, holding a bucket of feed. "Oh, look who's here," she said, pretending to be surprised. "Your fence must not be as strong as you thought. You did this," I accused. "You broke it again and let your cattle in." She raised her eyebrows in mock innocence. "Prove it." I pointed my phone camera at her. "Gladly." Karen laughed, a shrill, taunting sound. "Go ahead, make your little videos. I've got a friend on the HOA board who'll swear that this land was always meant for shared grazing. You'll just look like the angry neighbor who can't get along with anyone." It hit me then this wasn't just Karen acting alone. She had her hooks deep into the HOA. Her friends on the board backed her every move. She could twist the rules, manipulate the paperwork, and make me out to be the bad guy. I'd seen her do it to other neighbors. One family down the road had to repaint their barn 3 times because she claimed it didn't match the community aesthetic. Another man nearly lost his front porch because she called it a safety hazard. But I wasn't those neighbors. I wasn't afraid of her, and I sure as hell wasn't going to roll over and let her destroy my livelihood. I spent the next few days documenting everything, every hoof print, every broken fence post, every time I caught her cattle on my land. I also called a local lawyer, someone who'd gone up against HOAs before. His name was Mike Henson, and when I told him what was happening, he chuckled. "Sounds like you've got a real piece of work there. Don't worry, we'll get her." Mike explained how HOA power worked, how they loved to intimidate homeowners who didn't know their rights. But in this case, he said, Karen had stepped way out of line. She can't trespass or cause damage to private property. That's not just a civil matter. That's potentially criminal. Hearing that gave me some comfort, but Karen wasn't slowing down. A few nights later, I caught her on my security camera sneaking around near the fence, tossing feed into my pasture to lure her cattle back. It was like she wanted to provoke me, to push me into making a mistake. The next morning, she had the audacity to show up on my porch with a fake smile. "We really should work this out," she said sweetly, as if the past few days hadn't happened. "You let my cattle graze for free, and I'll make sure your property taxes stay low. You know I've got connections." I stared at her, disbelief written all over my face. "You think you can bribe me with promises, lady? I don't care who you know. Get your cattle off my land, or the next time I see them here, I'll call animal control and the sheriff." Her smile dropped. "You wouldn't dare." "Try me," I said, slamming the door in her face. That night, I walked up to the wolf enclosure, my flashlight cutting through the dark. They moved gracefully in the shadows, their amber eyes reflecting the light as they watched me. These wolves weren't killers, but they were intimidating, and they knew how to follow commands. I'd raised them like my own family. I leaned on the fence, listening to their soft howls. A plan was forming in my mind, clearer and sharper by the minute. Karen was trying to bully me, to break me down. But what she didn't realize was that I had an edge she could never see coming. I turned toward the dark fields, my jaw set. Karen wants a fight, I murmured to myself. She's about to get one. I spent the next morning reinforcing my plan. Karen had pushed me too far, and now it was time to remind her that this ranch wasn't hers to abuse. The law would handle her eventually, but sometimes you have to send a message that doesn't need words. And nothing speaks louder out here than the wild, the real, untamed power of nature. I walked up the narrow trail leading to the wolf enclosure, a section of my land I'd fenced off years ago for conservation work. Most folks don't know that wolves, when raised properly, can be trained like dogs, only with more discipline and instinct. These weren't wild predators roaming free. They were part of a licensed sanctuary I'd built with my own two hands. I'd taken in abandoned pups, raised them, and taught them to stay within boundaries. But if they saw intruding livestock, well, that was another story. The cattle would scatter long before the wolves got close enough to even touch them. The alpha female, a silver-gray beauty named Luna, met me at the gate. She gave a low, soft growl, not a threat, but a greeting. I reached down and scratched behind her ears. "Good girl," I murmured. "We've got work to do." For the next few hours, I prepped their training area. I loaded a few scent markers into the pasture where Karen's cattle like to graze. Wolves are smart. All it takes is the scent of a stranger, a sound, and they'll know what to do. I made sure every step of this plan was safe. The wolves wouldn't harm the cattle, but they'd spook them enough to send them running far from my property. By noon, I spotted Karen's truck parked by the HOA office down the road. I knew she'd be gone for a few hours, probably cooking up some scheme with her friends on the board. It was the perfect time to run a test. I walked back to the enclosure, opened the inner gate, and whistled sharply. Luna and her pack, 6 in total, trotted out, their fur glistening in the sun. They moved like shadows, silent and watchful, their noses twitching as they picked up the scent of Karen's cattle across the field. "Stay low," I said, pointing toward the pasture. The wolves understood the tone, not the words. They padded behind me, tails stiff, eyes sharp. My heart pounded as I led them toward the boundary, keeping a steady pace. I wasn't sure how the cattle would react, but I was about to find out. When we reached the edge of my field, I gave a short whistle. Luna let out a single deep howl, a sound that sent shivers down my spine, even though I'd heard it 100 times. The cattle froze, their ears flicking nervously. Then, as the wolves fanned out and began pacing along the fence line, the herd panicked. One cow mooed loudly, and within seconds, the entire group turned tail and stampeded back toward Karen's land. I watched, a grim smile spreading across my face. "That's what happens when you trespass," I muttered. The wolves didn't even touch them, they just showed presence. That's all it took. I called the pack back with a sharp command, and they trotted back toward me, tails wagging slightly. I crouched down and scratched Luna's neck. "Good job, girl. You just taught Karen's herd a lesson." Later that afternoon, Karen showed up at the fence, her face redder than a fire truck. "What the hell did you do?" she screamed. "My cows are terrified. They nearly broke through my barn trying to get away." I leaned on the fence, calm and collected. Oh, maybe they saw something they didn't like. You know, wild animals around here can be unpredictable. That's why I keep my land secure. Maybe you should do the same. You let wolves loose near my cattle. That's dangerous. I'll report you to the HOA and animal control. I shrugged. Report whatever you want. My wolves are on my land, behind my fences, just like your cattle should be. You don't want them scared? Keep them off my property. She glared at me, her hands clenched into fists. You think you've won. This isn't over. No, I said, locking eyes with her. It's just beginning. As she stormed off, I felt a strange calm wash over me. For the first time, Karen wasn't the one with all the control. She didn't know it yet, but the game had changed. I wasn't just defending my land anymore. I was sending a message that I wouldn't be bullied. That night, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I fed the wolves their dinner and sat with them for a while, watching the stars come out. Out here, you learn to trust your gut and your grit. Karen thought her HOA rules made her untouchable, but I had something stronger: a pack, a ranch, and a will to protect both. That night, I couldn't sleep. The image of Karen's smug grin burned in my mind. I lay awake, listening to the distant sounds of the night, the whisper of wind through the pines, the occasional chirp of crickets, and I knew Karen wouldn't stop. She'd be back, probably with more cattle, maybe even with a few tricks up her sleeve. But I was ready. Around midnight, the sound I'd been expecting came: the dull clatter of a gate opening, followed by the low moo of cattle being herded in. I sat up, heart pounding. She'd done it again. Karen had chosen the worst possible time to cross me, and this time, I wasn't just going to stand there and argue. I pulled on my boots, grabbed a flashlight, and walked out to the fence. The moon was full, casting long silver shadows across the field. Her cattle were back, trampling over my land as if it were their own. I spotted Karen's silhouette standing near her truck, holding a flashlight and yelling commands to her herd. "Karen," I called, my voice booming across the night air. "You're trespassing. I told you this would be the last time." She turned, her face illuminated by the beam of her flashlight. "You don't own the night, cowboy. My cattle need grazing, and you can't stop me." I smiled to myself, a cold and steady smile. "Oh, I can stop you, and you're about to see how." I whistled once, a sharp, piercing note that cut through the night. From the darkness of the tree line behind me came the low, haunting howl of Luna and her pack. The sound echoed across the valley, deep and primal. Karen froze, her light trembling in her hand. "What was that?" she asked, her voice suddenly unsure. I didn't answer. I just whistled again, and the wolves appeared at the edge of the field, their eyes glowing like embers in the moonlight. They weren't charging or attacking. They didn't need to. They simply stood there, tall and silent, their presence alone enough to send a chill down anyone's spine. The cattle sensed them instantly. Their ears shot up, and within seconds, panic set in. They bellowed and stampeded, running in every direction to get as far away from the wolves as possible. Karen's voice turned from smug to frantic as she shouted, "Stop, stop, you stupid animals." I leaned on the fence, watching the scene unfold. "Looks like they're not too fond of trespassing either," I said calmly. "You're insane," Karen screamed, pointing her flashlight at me. "You can't use wolves to scare my herd. That's dangerous. I'll sue you for this." "Dangerous," I replied, my voice steady. "No, Karen, what's dangerous is you ignoring property lines, breaking fences, and thinking the rules don't apply to you. My wolves never left my land, just like your cattle should have stayed off it." She stomped her foot, her face red with fury. "This isn't over. I'll call the sheriff, the HOA, anyone I have to. You'll regret this." I took a slow step closer to the fence, letting the moonlight hit my face. "Call whoever you want. I've got cameras recording everything. You broke in. You trespassed. You caused damage. I'm done playing nice." The wolves howled again, a chorus of wild, echoing cries that sent Karen scrambling to round up what was left of her herd. The cattle were scattered halfway across the road by now, some running toward her property, others disappearing into the open range beyond. I gave another whistle, and my wolves fell back, trotting gracefully toward me. Not a single one had crossed the fence. Perfect control, perfect timing. Karen's voice cracked as she yelled, "This is war. You hear me?" "War," I chuckled. "War, no. Karen, this is me protecting what's mine. You've been warned." By the time she finally got her cattle moving, it was close to 2 a.m. She sped off in her SUV, tires spitting gravel as she went. I stood there in the cool night air, the wolves at my side, feeling a satisfaction I hadn't felt in weeks. For once, I wasn't just reacting to Karen's nonsense, I was taking a stand. As I closed the gate to the wolf enclosure, Luna lingered near me, her amber eyes glowing in the faint moonlight. I crouched down and rubbed her neck. "Good girl," I whispered. "You showed her what happens when someone messes with us." Walking back to the house, I felt a strange calm settle over me. Karen would be furious, no doubt planning her next move, but I wasn't worried. If she wanted to escalate this, I had plenty more in store legal. practical, and otherwise. She'd crossed the wrong rancher, and now she knew it. By morning, word of what happened had already spread like wildfire through the neighborhood. It seemed Karen had wasted no time calling an emergency HOA meeting, claiming I had unleashed dangerous wild animals to terrorize her cattle. I wasn't surprised. Karen always knew how to spin a story to make herself look like the victim. When I walked into the small community hall that afternoon, every pair of eyes turned to me. Some neighbors looked curious, others nervous, and a few even smiled knowingly. Karen stood at the front, arms crossed, her face a mask of false concern. She was in full president mode, ready to command the room. "There he is," Karen announced dramatically as I entered. "The man who thinks it's okay to use wolves to threaten his neighbors and their animals. We cannot allow this kind of dangerous behavior in our community." I ignored her theatrics and walked to the center of the room. "Let's get one thing straight," I said, my voice firm and calm. "My wolves never crossed my property line. They didn't harm anyone or anything. All they did was remind your cattle that they don't belong on my land." Karen scoffed. "Oh, sure, that's your story, but everyone here knows those animals are wild. They could attack at any moment. You're putting all of us at risk." One of the older ranchers, Bill from down the road, spoke up. "Karen, I've known him for years. Those wolves are part of a conservation program. They're better trained than most dogs I've seen. Maybe if you hadn't kept pushing your cattle onto his pasture, this wouldn't be a problem." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. Karen's face tightened, but she pressed on. "This isn't about my cattle. This is about community safety. We all signed up to be part of this HOA to keep things orderly and safe. Wild predators don't belong near our homes." I held up a folder of papers. "These are permits from the State Wildlife Department and county records proving my wolves are legally kept and fully contained. They are on my land, and I've followed every rule to the letter. The real problem here is Karen's cattle trespassing on my property, damaging my pasture, and breaking fences. I have photos, videos, and even security footage of her sneaking onto my land at night." I placed the folder on the table where everyone could see the evidence. A few neighbors leaned forward, looking through the photos, whispering to each other. The tide in the room was shifting, and Karen knew it. "Those pictures don't prove anything," she snapped. "It could have been anyone who broke that fence." I stepped closer, my voice calm but cutting. "You really want to go there, Karen, because I've got footage of you, in your pink jacket, tossing feed into my pasture at midnight. Would you like me to play it for everyone right now?" Karen's face went pale. For once, she had nothing to say. The HOA board members glanced at one another, clearly uncomfortable. Finally, the vice president, a woman named Martha, spoke up. "Karen, I think you might have overstepped. We've heard complaints before about how you handle things, but this is serious. Trespassing and damaging someone's property is not something we can overlook." Karen tried to protest, but Martha raised a hand to silence her. "We'll review the footage and the documents. Until then, I suggest you keep your cattle on your own land." I nodded. That's all I've ever wanted. As I walked out of the hall, several neighbors stopped me to shake my hand. "Good for you," Bill said, grinning. About time someone stood up to her. Another neighbor, a quiet woman who ran a small goat farm, whispered, "She's been bullying all of us for years. You might have just given us the courage to push back." I appreciated their words, but I knew Karen wasn't done. People like her don't back down easily. That evening, I sat on my porch, watching the sun sink behind the hills. And sure enough, I saw her SUV roll slowly by my property. She didn't stop, but I could feel her eyes on me, seething with anger. I smiled, lifting my coffee mug in a mock toast toward her vehicle. "Round two's coming, Karen," I muttered, "but you're not going to like how it ends." That night, I called my lawyer, Mike, and filled him in on everything. "She's rattled," he said, chuckling, "but I think we've got enough to take her to court if you're ready." "I'm ready." I told him. It's time someone taught her what boundaries really mean. A week later, I found myself walking into the county courthouse, boots echoing on the polished floor. My lawyer, Mike Henson, strode beside me, his briefcase in one hand and that confident grin he always wore when he knew we had the upper hand. "Relax," he said, clapping me on the back. "We've got her. The evidence you collected is airtight." Karen was already there, sitting at the plaintiff's table with 2 other HOA board members flanking her like bodyguards. She wore a sharp business suit instead of her usual pink jacket, but the smug look on her face hadn't changed. When our eyes met, she gave me a thin, fake smile. I didn't return it. The judge, an older man with a reputation for being no-nonsense, took his seat. "Let's get this over with," he said. "Who wants to start Karen's lawyer?" A tall man with slicked back hair stood up. "Your Honor, my client, Ms. Karen Whitmore, has been subjected to harassment, intimidation, and dangerous conditions on her own property. The defendant, Mr. Harper, unleashed a pack of wolves, yes, wolves on her cattle, causing emotional distress, damage, and chaos. This behavior is reckless and unacceptable in a residential community." I clenched my jaw but stayed quiet. Mike had told me to let him handle this. He leaned back in his chair, completely unbothered, until the lawyer finished his speech. Then, Mike stood and addressed the judge. "Your Honor, let's talk about facts, not fairy tales. Mr. Harper owns a legally registered wildlife sanctuary on his ranch. His wolves never left his property. We have video evidence, photos, and even certified documents proving this. What did cross the line literally was Ms. Whitmore's cattle, which repeatedly trespassed onto my client's pasture, causing significant property damage. Not only that, but we have footage of Ms. Whitmore herself breaking his fence and trespassing in the middle of the night." Mike pulled out a tablet, tapping the screen to bring up a video. The courtroom went quiet as the footage played Karen, clearly visible in her pink jacket, tossing feed into my field while her cattle followed her in. The timestamp read midnight. Karen's face turned beet red. That's not me," she stammered. Mike smirked. "Then I suppose we have a twin running around, Your Honor. We can provide additional footage and photos if needed. Furthermore, we have documented the damage to Mr. Harper's pasture, which will cost thousands to repair. We're counterclaiming for full damages." The judge turned his gaze to Karen. "Ms. Whitmore, do you have an explanation for this?" Karen opened her mouth, then shut it. Her lawyer fumbled for words, mumbling something about misinterpretation and blurry footage, but the judge wasn't buying it. "I've seen enough," the judge said firmly. "It's clear that Ms. Whitmore and the HOA overstepped their authority. Property lines are not suggestions, and trespassing is illegal. I'm ruling in favor of Mr. Harper. Ms. Whitmore, you will pay for all damages to his property, including legal fees. And as for the HOA, I suggest you review your policies before trying to enforce rules that don't exist." Karen's jaw dropped. "What? You can't do this. I'm the HOA president." The judge raised an eyebrow. "And that means what?" "Exactly. That you can ignore the law? I think not. If I hear about any further harassment or false claims, I'll consider additional penalties. Do I make myself clear?" The silence that followed was deafening. Karen didn't answer, but the look on her face said it all: defeat, mixed with pure fury. Outside the courthouse, Mike clapped me on the shoulder. That was easier than I expected. "She's lucky we didn't push for more." I smiled, the tension finally leaving my body. I don't need more. I just need my land respected. A few neighbors were waiting outside, having heard about the case. Bill, the old rancher, gave me a thumbs up. "About time someone put Karen in her place," he said with a chuckle. "You did good." I thanked them. But I knew this wasn't just about me. Karen's power trip had made life miserable for a lot of folks in the neighborhood. Now, with her losing in court, the whole HOA would start to crumble under the weight of its own arrogance. That evening, I returned home and walked the fence line. The pasture was quiet, the sunset painting the sky in shades of gold and red. For the first time in weeks, I felt peace settling over the land. My wolves paced quietly in their enclosure, watching me with those sharp, knowing eyes. I whistled softly, and Luna came to the fence, pressing her head against my hand. "We did it, girl," I said. "We took back what's ours." But deep down, I knew this wasn't just the end of a battle. It was the start of something bigger. Karen wasn't the type to let go easily, but I was ready for whatever came next. The morning after the court ruling, I woke to a stillness I hadn't felt in weeks. No pounding hooves, no shouting voices, just the quiet hum of life on the ranch. As I stepped out onto the porch with a cup of coffee, I looked over my pasture. It wasn't perfect. The grass was still torn in patches. The fence still showed signs of Karen's meddling, but it was mine again. And the knowledge that the law had sided with me made every breath taste like victory. Later that day, a truck pulled into my driveway. To my surprise, it wasn't Karen but two of her HOA board members, Martha and Greg. Martha stepped out first, her hands raised like she was approaching a wild animal. We wanted to say, "Congratulations," she said cautiously. "What Karen did was wrong, and we should have spoken up sooner." Greg nodded. "She's been running this HOA like her personal empire for too long. We're calling for a vote to remove her as president." I couldn't help but smile. "That's probably the smartest thing I've heard come out of that HOA in years." Martha chuckled nervously. "You earned this win, Mr. Harper. And for what it's worth, I think a lot of us are relieved someone finally stood up to her." When they left, I felt something shift. For so long, Karen had ruled with fear and intimidation, making everyone feel like they owed her something, but not anymore. The community had seen her for what she was, and the scales had finally tipped. 2 days later, I got word that Karen had officially been removed from her position as HOA president. Apparently, the board had grown tired of her tantrums, especially after she tried blaming everyone but herself for the court ruling. I imagined the look on her face when they told her it must have been priceless. That evening, I built a small fire pit out back near the wolf enclosure. The sun was sinking, and the sky turned that deep orange that only happens on the open plains. I grilled a couple of steaks, saving the scraps for Luna and her pack. They came up to the fence quietly, watching me, their amber eyes glowing in the firelight. "You know," I said to them as if they could understand every word, "you did more than scare off cattle. You reminded me of what it means to stand my ground." Luna tilted her head, almost as if she was agreeing. The next day, I received a letter from Karen. It wasn't an apology she wasn't capable of, but it was close. A short, curt note that said, "I will no longer interfere with your property. Consider this matter closed." She didn't even sign it properly, just scrawled her name at the bottom like she was still too proud to admit defeat. I laughed when I read it. That's the closest I'll get to an "I'm sorry" from her. I muttered. The following weeks were quiet. I repaired the last of the damaged fences, replanted parts of the pasture, and spent more time with my wolves. Neighbors would stop by occasionally, bringing pies or just dropping in to say thanks. Bill, the old rancher, came over one evening and said, "You know, you didn't just win for yourself. You stood up for all of us." That stuck with me. I hadn't thought of it that way, but he was right. Sometimes it takes one person to push back to remind everyone else they have a voice too. As the days rolled on, life returned to normal, or as normal as it gets on a ranch. One crisp morning, I stood at the fence, watching the wolves move silently through their enclosure. I thought about everything that had happened, the fights, the court battles, the sleepless nights. And I realized something. Karen hadn't just tried to take my land, she'd tried to take my peace of mind. But instead of breaking me, she'd made me stronger. I turned back toward the house, the smell of fresh coffee drifting from the kitchen. Before I stepped inside, I glanced once more at the horizon, where the land stretched out wide and untamed, just like it should be. "This is home," I whispered to myself, "and nobody, not even Karen, will ever change that." That's the story of how I took on HOA Karen and won not just in court, but in reclaiming my pride and my land. Sometimes, standing your ground means finding the courage to fight back in ways no one expects. If you enjoyed this story, take a moment to reflect on your own battles and victories. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear where you're watching from and what stories you want to hear next.